Hello, welcome to The Conversation on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I'm Rita, Omodia. Today on The Conversation, we will be taking you to Sudan, where efforts to ensure ceasefire takes place has proved to be abortive. And now General al-Burhan is demanding permanent ceasefire from RSF in Khartoum, which is the main city of the fight.
Also on the program, we will be looking at Kenya, where Raila Odinga has sued President William Ruto over the formation of the Commission of Inquiry into the Shakahola tragedy and demanding the court declares the committee unconstitutional. Interesting development there. I wonder if Raila Odinga would ever give President William Ruto any break.
I don't think he doesn't plan to. I mean, that's a very strong opposition, if I must say. So for any act that William Ruto thinks he wants to make in Kenya, he should be well aware that Raila Odinga is right there to make sure he opposes the act. And you know, there was a very long video that Raila Odinga said actually putting William Ruto complicit in all these Shakahola tragedies. I mean,
how?
Yeah, he said that.
He wasn't even president. I mean, he was only president last year, August. So.
No, but he's saying that he was also engaged in the religious activities in Kenya. So he and the other people in this constitution are also complicit of this religious atrocities that went on.
Interesting take there. I really can't wait for us to get to the crux of the gist. And also in Nigeria, Nigeria's president-elect is off again. This time he's going to consult with stakeholders and businesses, you know, to bring investment into Nigeria. Much needed investment. But if you look at his travel trajectory so far, it might be on course to break President Buhari's record of traveling abroad. It looks like he will be doing a lot of traveling as president. Well,
hopefully the travel will bring about something good for the country and not just health travels. We know that the president is also traveling once again, I mean, for health reasons.
I think he's out of the country at the moment.
Yes, he is. He is out of the country. Definitely tough discussions we're definitely having. And we'll begin today with Sudan's discussion.
Yes, the current military ruler of Sudan, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has emphasized that any negotiations with the paramilitary rapid support forces must be accompanied by a ceasefire if they are to have any real chance of success. General al-Burhan was speaking in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where talks initiated with the support of the United States is aimed at putting an end to the violent conflict that has ravaged Sudan.
The violence has already claimed hundreds of lives and forced countless others to flee their homes, creating a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Despite the initial optimism surrounding the talks, little progress has been made so far. The discussions have centered around the possibility of establishing a lasting ceasefire, which would be a crucial first step towards a more peaceful future for Sudan. Let's take a look at this clip, and when we come back, we'll definitely be discussing with our analysts for today.
Despite the positive momentum created earlier in the reporting period, the outbreak of violence in the Sudan may deeply impact the chance for political progress on Abyei and border issues. With fighting ongoing and mediation efforts underway, the United Nations will continue to support the Sudan and South Sudan when dialogue on Abyei resumes. The humanitarian environment in Abyei remained challenging, with UN and non-governmental organizations aiding some 212,000 vulnerable people in Abyei, including roughly 30,000 internally displaced persons. Intercommunal violence impacted humanitarian efforts, with some organizations withdrawing from the Agok area in February and 2 aid workers being killed during an attack in Romamie on 2nd January.
The unprecedented conflict that erupted in Sudan on the 15th of April between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, as well as having a devastating impact on the Sudanese population, is also profoundly affecting the bilateral relationship between Sudan and South Sudan. The humanitarian, security, economic, and political consequences of the developments in the Sudan have raised concerns among the South Sudanese political leadership. There is the potential for more than 200,000 South Sudanese refugees hosted by the Sudan returning if we do not see stability returning soon. Now, this would be a challenge to a country where 2/3 of the population already require humanitarian assistance. As the Sudanese authorities are not currently in a position to effectively protect their borders, the insecurity at the border between Sudan and South Sudan could increase with cross-border movements of armed and criminal groups.
And there you have it, envoys and representatives all discussing about situation in Sudan and how dire it is for the country. And now joining us for this conversation, we have El-Bashir Idris, is a public affairs analyst. He joins us from Cardiff, Wales. Thank you so much, El-Bashir, for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so can you quickly describe the current mediation process between Hamdan Daglo and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan? What exactly have been the main objectives for this mediation effort?
Well, now we're here on our 26th day of the conflict that started in Sudan. Since yesterday, they've been supposed to have negotiation talks with each other. However, the dynamics between the two, the RSF and the SAF, have been very uneasy with very high tensions. It's been reported that yesterday, the two refused to even negotiate with each other, even though they are within the same building, essentially, because there were certain conditions that each party wanted to have before sitting on that table. However, they do so at the expense at the timing, as we've just seen with the reports of the humanitarian crisis that's happening every time they stall their negotiations. It just keeps on adding more fuel to the fire. The conditions that they wish to reach is not within my understanding as of now. However, it is imperative because the only people within these negotiations are the US ambassador, the military attaché, SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces. However, there is no inclusion of the UN, as reported by Volker Perthes on his tweet earlier this morning or late last night, where he confirmed that he was not invited and had not been to these negotiations. And it doesn't seem as if they wish to bring in the UN. Also, the civilian components within the negotiations, they haven't been brought in as well. So it's really become a talking table between regional players, the belligerents in Sudan, and international players. So regional being Saudi supporting the SAF, UAE being on the RSF camp, and the Americans essentially being that extra mediator in the room. However, we're still not seeing much cohesivity. You could say there's still a lot of friction, and the more they keep on rubbing hard against each other, the worse it's going to be for the whole country and the region as a whole.
And the situation hasn't improved at all in Khartoum as we speak. You did talk about obstacles of, this belligerents not wanting to, certain preconditions for those talks. The ordinary people in Sudan that are feeling the pain of this conflict almost think the Saudi exercise is an exercise in futility because no result is coming out of it. These two belligerents refuse to negotiate. Now, what other obstacles have been encountered in the mediation efforts between Hamdan Daglo and General Fattah al-Burhan? Is there any way the international community, apart from the threat of sanctions? I mean, the United States State Department the other day said it was going to take sanction individuals that are preventing this talks from moving forward and also destabilizing Sudan. How much of an effect will that have? And what can be done? What can the Saudis and other players, I do know they have interest, like you said, the Rapid Support Forces are supported by the Emiratis, and then the Saudis support the SAF. So what can we do to move this talks forward to prevent this humanitarian crisis from getting worse?
Well, the initial part is that even though they're at mediation with each other, there is still conflict outgoing and breaking off in parts of the country. We've seen video footages of RSF taking down helicopters. We've seen footages of the armed forces shooting rockets from helicopters. We've seen constant clashes back and forth and a lot of propaganda on who's controlling what area of the capital, to play off that, you know, the one side is winning more than the other. And as the rest of the world watches and is trying to disseminate this disinformation, or trying to understand this disinformation rather, it's become quite difficult, especially because I've came on this show weeks before and I've said it in terms of the humanitarian aid and passageway, and we've all been petitioning and pushing forward for this. And yet I still find myself, and we all still find ourselves in the same position of that deadlock, that gridlock, that without the permission of these guys, unfortunately, the ones with the guns, we can't go forward that much. However, actions by the US of the sanctions, I'm not very... well, it's a good first step, but in terms of its effectiveness, well, let's be honest, Sudan was already on the terrorist list for over 30 years or 20 years during the Bashir era, and they've created a network, an infrastructure that bypasses these sanctions. And the question is, will these sanctions actually work? They've already had this network. They've already used it before. It's more than likely that these sanctions won't work. Sudan is already used to punitive measures and economic sanctions. So if anything, this may not even hinder the progress to stop this conflict. If anything, from what I understand, there are a lot of bank accounts, and these bank accounts are not only in Sudan, but they're also outside of Sudan in regional places. And these bank accounts are also under the names of individuals and organizations that makes it very difficult to all of a sudden close down that bank account. So even if the RSF had money in, I don't know, somewhere in one of the Gulf states, and the sanctions were in place, well, the sanctions are towards the individuals who are directly involved in this conflict. However, it doesn't go for the ones that are funding this conflict and still providing a means of supply for these fighters. So the rest of the humanitarian side of things, it gets more dire. Even though Sudan has dropped off the news in terms of visibility, that does not mean the situation has improved. It's just gotten a lot more worse. So the reason why we need these ceasefires right now, very importantly for the humanitarian aid, it's simple as it is. It needs to get to the people. However, as well as that, the access. So Khartoum has become locked off. So you can leave Khartoum, but you can't enter Khartoum. And it's become a problem now. If local NGOs, if local groups of people, volunteers want to send in supplies into Khartoum, it becomes even much more dangerous to do so because there's no safe route.
Sorry, just before you ask him the next question, what's the situation in Khartoum's twin city, Omdurman?
So Omdurman has seen a bit of a movement and mobilization. It has seen a couple of attacks still within the central Wad Nabawi area next to Omdurman market and such. There's been a bunch of media and content of homes collapsing, people evacuating. Even my personal family from those areas had to leave. And it's more or less what we once thought as Omdurman as the safe zone compared to Khartoum or Haven. It's become a bit more difficult. And the strategic point is the bridges. So we have Khartoum on the left, Omdurman to the right, and there's a number of bridges, two main bridges that connect the two, and three actually, between Omdurman and Khartoum. Now we've seen a lot of the Bahri, which is Khartoum North. We've seen a lot of the fighting taking place between these bridges, as it's an important supply line for any armed forces, any civilian, and so it's a constant cat and mouse, you can say, between the two sides of one taking the bridge, another side taking the bridge, defending it and not defending it. And it's important as well because the northern side of the bridge, the most northern bridge between Omdurman and Bahri, called the Halfaya Bridge, is very close to the airport during the times of evacuation, which is Wadi Saidna Airport. And that airport could be, potentially used as a supply port for either side to bring in further supplies. But essentially, the way that Sudan works in its aid and its logistics, with Khartoum being in the capital in the middle, usually direct aid or supplies would come into the capital and then it would disperse outwards. However, this top-down approach, it doesn't seem to be working now, or it's impossible for it to work because of the conflict. So Sudan and the aid agencies are looking for other places where they can bring in these resources, but effectively disperse them out as well. And unfortunately, we can see that Port Sudan, even though it's centered all the way to the east, by the Red Sea, it would be difficult logistically to send out aids and supplies to the rest of the country from there.
Now, it's quite sad that all of this is happening due to this power sharing arrangement between those two major military rivals. And there's a comment coming from General al-Burhan, and it somewhat reflects the urgent need for a cessation of hostilities and the army's readiness to observe this. But at the same time, it somewhat paints the rapid support forces as the main trigger for this conflict, because it says there's no need for negotiations when there's no ceasefire. This is coming from al-Burhan, which makes it look like he's ready for it, but the RSF is the one trying to trigger the conflict. So what do you make of this and this issue of the power sharing arrangement that we're seeing between al-Burhan and Hamdan Daglo, also known as Hemeti?
Well, we've seen a lot of misinformation these past few days in terms of who's blaming who, but at the same time, the misinformation campaigns have now started targeting civilians in saying that the RSF may one day say that the civilians are supporting the army, the army says that the civilians are supporting RSF, and that both sides are effectively, supposedly fighting on behalf of the people, which is kind of ridiculous. And so if Burhan says that there needs to be a ceasefire before negotiations start, at least he understands that the meaning of the table and the meaning that why we need to sit around a round table and discuss. Because if these guys were to leave the table, then it will be absolutely difficult to bring them back in. I mean, today's day 26, negotiations began day 25 yesterday. So it took us almost a month for us to get to the table in the first place. If this opportunity, misses, then who knows how longer it could go without us getting that opportunity. As for the comments of the generals and what they say on behalf of the Sudanese people, one thing I've learned is that there's new stuff that comes out every single day. As I said, you're on. They make you feel as part as them, and the next day they attack the civilians. So their words and actions don't match up, and so the Sudanese people, I'm pretty sure they've had enough of this, and businesses are being hurt or have been hurt, and livelihoods as well. And if we've seen the refugee situations going on. It's not sustainable. So regardless of whatever they say, the Sudanese people just want sustainability. May that look like in peace, may that look like through a civilian government. Though I am very happy to hear that international communities and neighboring nations are calling for a civilian government, we can hopefully move forward from this. However, for the time being, the Sudanese people aren't going to fall for simple words. We've seen this happen many times. It's just a matter of, can we get action done? Can they execute?
And this brings me to this question. I'm happy you talked about the civilians, because they're more in number and they're the ones that matter the most. They're the ones that are, they're the soul of the country, those ordinary Sudanese people. Now, as civilians represented in these negotiations in any form in Jeddah, what is the latest with the powerful forces of freedom of change? Do they have any stake, or do civilian groups, civil society groups, do they have any say in all of what is happening in Sudan?
Well, unfortunately, no. As I said, the US, the SAF, the RSF, and regional powers are involved in this negotiations. However, the voice of the people isn't here, nor is there's the UN, but the people's voice isn't here. So they're not represented on the negotiating table. And this is exactly how more conflict always starts. This is how Darfur started. Darfur started with the Darfuris essentially not being given an access to the table during the early 2000s and the 1990s in Khartoum by the Islamist Kaysan regime. And so essentially what happens when you start singling out the community or singling out civilians is we've seen it with Darfur, we've seen it with Nuba Mountains. People will take things up with their own hands and they will eventually keep on raising tensions because they will believe, well, hey, you're not fighting on my behalf. And you're just destroying my property. People's homes were created by their grandfathers. People's homes are like a museum of legacy, and what the two generals are doing are essentially destroying those museums, destroying those legacies, and destroying all the archives that the people have built over many decades and centuries. So going forward, the Sudanese people, let's say the FFC, some people report they may have had a hand in playing in causing the RSF to become the monster that it is in terms of legitimizing it. And some are against that. We're still analyzing that and looking back on history to understand what really happened. But in terms of a civilian front, it's a bit more weaker, correct, but in terms of an anti-war voice or an anti-war coalition, that is definitely strong, and that's shared between all parties and all stakeholders in Sudan and outside of Sudan as well, because at the end of the day, the only ones profiting from this seems to be a group of a very concentrated small group of men at the behest of millions in the country.
True.
Now, earlier on, you talked about the fact that, you can't necessarily trust the words of these generals. They all have their own interests. But earlier on, al-Burhan talked about leading Sudan towards a civilian rule. And that's what we started from. We're looking at negotiations for transition to democracy. Then we had protests saying that they don't want the military in the discussions, but rather they only want themselves talking about transition to democracy. So what exactly is the vision of al-Burhan? And do you see, after all this is over, a recapture of institutions by civilians? Is it possible, or it's far away from that?
The key word here is when we say civilians, do we mean everybody across the board, or do we mean a specific group of people? And I'll let you know, Burhan was the first one to also invite the members of the former regime from Turkey when the coup happened in the 25th of October 2021. So if this shows his more so bias, or even if it's unconscious bias, his allegiances, you can say, and he wants to go to a civilian government and civilian rule and democracy, then it really comes into question of who is the military going to back? Who are they going to support? Is it going to be the same people that the people overthrew after 30 years? It really shouldn't. It's absolutely not. And if the Sudanese people find out that the term of civilian government means bringing back the people from the previous 30 years, then it's not going to look like a happy future for the rest of the country. So in terms of democracy, in terms of the civilians and the civilian government, the real question is who is allowed to participate? And at the end of the day, after we've seen the wrongdoings of what's happened in the past, I hope that the military leaders and the civilian leaders can come together and understand that, certain mistakes can't be repeated again, especially if we wish to move forward into the 21st century.
Thank you so much for your insights and your time. Al-Bashir Idris, a public affairs analyst, join us from Cardiff in Wales. We do appreciate your time and
Thank you.
insight. Thank you.